You're listening to the Bob Dutko Show, fearlessly defending the faith with you every day. How many times have you folks found yourself kind of wrestling with God about certain things involving Him, certain decisions that He makes? Whether it's overt decisions, whether it's passive decisions, certain things that God allows, certain times where He didn't come through for you, didn't do for you what you expected Him to do, things about Him that just don't make sense. And you feel like God is making the wrong decision. Now, logically, we know better than that, but emotionally, you do experience this. And we're going to explore all of this now with Darren Schalk. He holds a bachelor's in pastoral ministry, master's in church leadership, serves as coordinator of Christian education and curriculum development for the Church of God in Prophecy. He's author of this book entitled, Dear God, We Need to Talk, Wrestling with God on Questions of Life and Faith. It's from Charisma House Publishing. And Darren Schalk joins us now. Reverend Schalk, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm thrilled to be on your show because I actually grew up in Michigan.
Really?
So it's a pleasure to be on you. Maybe I've got some childhood friends and some family tuning in even right now, hopefully.
Oh, well, that's great. Well, welcome back home. We're very happy to have you. You know, one of the things that I've said very often, and one of the first things you talk about in your book is, you know, when I want to win an argument with God. Now, I've said this for years, that I'm a very left-brain, logical, analytical thinker, and whenever there's something about God that confuses me or doesn't make sense, I see this as very binary. There's one of two options. Either A, God's right and I'm wrong, or B, I'm right and God's wrong. Those are really the only two options when I'm at odds with something that God and His sovereignty is deciding to do or not do. There's not a third option. So I have to ask myself, as a thinking being who has a brain, am I really willing to entertain the possibility that I know more than God about a particular scenario, and I have more wisdom and know the better thing to do than God does, and He needs to learn from me about how to handle fill-in-the-blank scenario that I'm facing, big or small? I can't bring myself to say that intellectually, so I'm forced to puzzle fit myself into the second option, which is God knows more than I do. He knows more about what's right or wrong than I do. I have limited understanding. I have to trust in Him, even though it makes absolutely no sense to me. So that's how I tend to get through those moments. But I know not everybody's the same, Reverend. How do you tend to look at it?
You know, there's an underlying belief, at least I was raised in the church, and there seemed to be some underlying idea that it wasn't okay to question God in that sort of manner. Mm-hmm. And so you end up falling to that option B that you mentioned, well, I must be wrong and God's right, and that sort of settles it. But what if it's okay to actually bring those questions to God? What if you can actually come to God and say, God, I do not agree with what you're doing here. It does not make any logical sense, so you need to speak to me and tell me what's going on. And I think that is okay. And as you mentioned, we opened the book with that idea. Job brought his questions to God.
Yeah, but he got yelled at for the next 2.5 pages.
Well, that's the end, yes. But he also, you know, in the end of that book, God honors Job, and he makes this interesting statement, and I think it's chapter 42 and verse 7, I think, where he says, God was pleased with Job, but upset with Job's friends, because they had not spoken of him what was right, as this servant Job had, the NIV says. And so there's this underlying idea that maybe what Job said to God was okay. And you look through that book and you see Job saying some very challenging things. In fact, Job opens his mouth in Job chapter 3 and verse 1. And it says, after this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And then he goes on this divine sort of rant that, you know, I wish I'd never been born. God, what are you doing with me? But in the end, God still honors him. And so when you look at that, I think you can bring your stuff to God. I think you absolutely can bring anything you have to Him.
Okay. Now, that doesn't, as we mentioned with Job, that doesn't necessarily mean that God is going to say, well, okay, I'll give you the answer to that then. So don't we kind of have to prepare ourselves for the fact that God may choose to give us an answer for that, or he may not. And I would argue in most cases, statistically, according to his MO, he's just going to require us to trust him and not explain himself.
Yes. Job had his questions. He brought them all. And the book of Job has 2 chapters at the beginning that tell a story, and it ends with about half a chapter of concluding the story. But in the middle, you have nearly 40 chapters of just conversation, just dialogue. And those chapters don't get as much attention as just the story, but that's where you see Job and his friends asking all of these questions. And it's interesting, if you look into the friends address everything they have directly at Job. They only talk about God. Job, if you read through that, you'll notice over and over again, Job will respond by speaking to the friends, but inevitably, he so often ends up directing his comments directly to God, speaking to God.
Right.
And but you're right, in the end, God comes down and he answers none of Job's questions. In fact, it's like he got so tired of hearing all these men talk about him as if he weren't in the room. And he shows up, and he answers none of Job's questions, and in fact chides him and says, brace yourself like a man now, because you've questioned me. Now it's my turn to question you. He puts Job and his friends in their rightful place.
Right.
And then Job has this moment where he realizes, I didn't get the answers. What I got was God. And so often I think we seek answers, and what God gives is an encounter. And that's when everything falls into perspective. So, one, I think it's okay to come to God with anything you have, but you should be careful, because in the end, you don't know what you might hear, or more importantly, what you might see. And answers aren't necessarily always as important as the encounter itself.
Sure. Hang on just a moment. We'll pick it up from there in a couple of minutes. More with Darren Schalk. The book, again, folks, is Dear God, We Need to Talk, Wrestling with God on Questions of Life and Faith. You're listening to The Bob Dutko Show. You're listening to The Bob Dutko Show. Continuing our discussion with Darren Schalk. He is author of the book, Dear God, We Need to Talk, Wrestling with God on Questions of Life and Faith. And, Reverend, before we get to some of the other questions and struggles that we have with God, one more thing I want to ask you about him not answering our questions, basically not explaining himself, if you will, and in most cases he does not. Why do you think that is? I mean, what do you think the main reason that God chooses to basically say to us, no, not only am I not going to give you what you want, I'm not even going to tell you what my reasoning is. You're just going to have to deal with it. I mean, what do you think his reason for that is?
I think the bottom line of Christianity, and the main reason God does almost all of what he does, is pushing us to have faith in him. Hebrews tells us that without faith it's impossible to please God. Now, that verse could have said anything else, but it chose to zero out faith. And you look into the Old Testament, you see stories like him asking Abraham to sacrifice his promised son Isaac. And what a crazy request that was. But he was testing his faith. I think we go through difficult moments because God is testing our faith. We go through struggles and sufferings and trials because our faith is being tested. And God has this way of wanting to prove that we believe in him and trust in him. And if he gave answers, our faith would come from a place of logic. And God doesn't want us to line up all of the religions and see which one is most logical to believe in. He wants us to trust him even when we don't have answers.
Right. Even though I would argue Christianity is the one that's the most logical to believe in. But you're right. That's not the reason that we need to be having that faith in him.
Yeah, and that's what I would say as well.
Sure. Now, you also, one of the questions you ask is, why does God make me work so hard? What do you mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. He asks me to do more than I'm comfortable with so often. We talk about that, and he pushes me out of my comfort zone so often. You'll see the line throughout the book, I hate that about God. Why does he do this, or why does he do that? And that's one of the things that at points can get under your skin, and you say, God, do we really have to do it this way? My wife will tell you that sometimes I am lazy. Those are her words, not mine. And I think God will sometimes repeat that phrase and speak that to me even when I'm praying. Darren, you need to pick it up just a little bit. And He pushes me further than I want to go. So that's one of the questions I have for God. Can we find an easier way? And so often the answer is no, we can't.
One of the really tough issues in this, and as much as I hate to say this, but there's one theme that runs through a lot of these questions that many of us struggle with regarding God, and it's that theme of how this affects me, and I don't like this for me, and so I'd like you to make things better for me. I mean, I hate to say it, but we really are kind of narcissistic when it comes to turning God into our servants, aren't we?
Yeah, undoubtedly. That's human nature.
Yeah, I know. Now, you also talk about God's provision. You say, what about when God doesn't provide the way that I'd expect? And this is a difficult one because, hey, he's Jehovah Jireh, he's my provider. We trust in him. He will supply us all of our needs, and we know this, and it's scripturally true. But then what happens is somebody's electricity gets off, and they get shut off, they get foreclosed, and they go, wait a minute, well, I guess he didn't provide my needs. Maybe what we need to do is re-examine the definition of the word need.
Yeah, needs and wants are certainly two different things.
Right.
God taught me about His provision in a very interesting way. When I was in college, there was an older lady in our church that I grew up in, sweetest lady in the world, and I went off to college, and I was on my last dime. I was down to my last pack of ramen noodles. And I got up that morning, and I went to my mailbox, back when we still used mail, and I said, Lord, I need something. I went in, I opened up that mailbox, and there was a card in there from this wonderful lady it was a happy birthday card, and there was a $5 bill in there. And my birthday wasn't for another month. And I just thank God for that. And I found my mother called me about 5 minutes later as I was leaving the post office and told me that this dear sister had passed away the night before. And in one of her last acts of kindness, a month before my birthday, she sent me a birthday card with $5 in it because God had heard my prayer. And this is the sort of thing that she had always done. And it humbled me to think that God used her in her last moments to help me in my time of need. And God showed me how rich He was with that simple $5 gift that to this day still moves me. And so often we ask for so much of God when all we actually need is so little.
Right. Hang on just a moment. We'll spend our last few minutes together next more with Reverend Darren Schalk, author of the book, Dear God, We Need to Talk, Wrestling with God on Questions of Life and Faith. It's from Passio Publishing, a division of Charisma House. And you're listening to The Bob Dutko Show. Spending our last few minutes here on The Bob Dutko Show with Reverend Darren Schalk. He is author of the book, Dear God, We Need to Talk, Wrestling with God on Questions of Life and Faith. And so, Reverend, when going through some of the challenging questions that we do have with God, obviously we can't get to all of them that you talk about in your book, but I do want to at least address a few of them. One of them, of course, when God doesn't make everything better. And this is one of those big universal things that I think applies not only to people's own individual lives, but also to the earth itself and all the pain and the suffering. And God is an all-powerful God, and He has the power, He has the ability to fix the problems that we see right now and to end the pain and the suffering, yet He chooses for now not to do it. And so there's a lot of people that say that makes God pretty uncaring or pretty mean in my view. There are people that will say that, certainly non-Christian, but some Christians struggle with that too. How do you respond?
Yeah, that goes back to that age-old question of why do good people suffer? Why do we go through these things in life that God could end? Why do we deal with sickness and death? And first part of it, obviously, is the curse you see in Genesis 1 that came about through mankind's sin. But I keep going back to that idea of faith. If everything if all our ducks were lined up in a row and God, just came down and ended all suffering and all issues, it wouldn't take faith to believe in him. So the bottom line for that question for me is, when things don't make sense, when you see a God doing something that you don't agree with, can you say, God, I trust you anyway?
Right.
And that seems to be the bottom line question for all of those sort of experiences in life.
Right. Well, and it seems to me that that's what God wants from us. I mean, I think God wants to know if we love him and serve him and worship him and trust him because he is God, or because he performs to our expectations. I mean, which one is it? And I'll tell you what, I've said this many times, I'll say it again. I'm very thankful that he doesn't make me earn my place as his child, and that my salvation is not dependent upon me measuring up to his expectations, because then guess what? I'm going to fall short. Why in the world am I holding him to a higher standard than he holds me to?
Yeah. Yeah.
Not to mention the fact it's not even a higher standard. What, you got a standard higher than God's? So,
right.
It does seem, though, that this is what God wants from us, though, and it does kind of make sense to me that he would do that. Now, what about when you say that sometimes you wish God hadn't invented emotions? Explain that.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I have a whole few ideas on that. Emotions, I think the subline there is riding the emotional roller coaster without puking, or something along those lines.
Right.
But yeah, that emotional roller coaster that we all ride. You have these immense highs and these immense lows in life, and you wonder why can't we just stay on the mountaintop, God? Why do we have to go through moments of sorrow and difficulty and for many even depression? Those times when you see things not making sense and it feels like you can't get out. Why are we created that way? One of those questions that I'd like to sit down with God and say, why do we have all of these things? Why weren't we made like the Stepford Wives or Simon Cowell and have no emotions at all, or at least not show any?
Right.
But he has created us that way, and in fact, we're created in the image of God. And if you look into the Old Testament, you will see a God who can be pretty emotional and even be described as emotional. He's jealous. He gets angry. In the most powerful verse in the New Testament that I think is the shortest, where it says Jesus wept, experienced the emotions of mankind, and made in that image, God has given us that ability, for lack of a better word, to have those highs and lows. And boy, doesn't it make life a grand journey?
Yeah, that it does. Hey, let me ask you one final question here. I think of, there's a scene, kind of a famous scene from a movie that's not a great movie at all. It's an Al Pacino movie where he played the devil. And he played this movie with Keanu Reeves. It's called Devil's Advocate, is what it's called. And there's a scene in this movie when Al Pacino is going on a rant against God, from Satan's perspective. And one of his criticisms of God is he creates a bunch of rules, okay? Don't taste, don't touch, don't do this. But then he creates people with the desire for those things. So it's like he creates you to do what he then instructs you not to do. All right? And then he goes on to say, and then there he is sitting up there just laughing his head off. Well, obviously it's a cynical approach to looking at this. But there are a lot of people who do sometimes feel that way, and I think Christians as well, when it relates to, for example, the temptation to sin. And you address that in your book. When God wants me to stop sinning, are you kidding me? You want me to stop sinning? You make me with these desires to do the very things that you say are sinful and harmful and I don't want you to do. God, if you want me to run up the escalator, why are you having it going down and making me run up the down escalator, go against the grain of my flesh? Why does it have to be that way? How do you answer stuff like that?
We often think of freedom as the ability to do anything we desire. And sometimes I think we say when you come to know God and you come to serve Jesus, that you are truly freed. And I don't think we're freed in that manner. In fact, I might say the opposite, and I think you get this from Romans chapter 6, where it says, we have traded in our chains to sin and become slaves to God. And so when you move from that moment of not believing to believing in God and serving, you're not freed from your chains. You simply change masters. Whereas once those wicked inclinations and evil things that would pull us down, we can now chain ourselves to God, and suddenly we're pulled upward. And there is such a freedom in finding that moment of saying, I'm releasing my chains to my desires, and I'm handing them to Jesus so that he can make me better. There's just something about overcoming those desires that is so freeing in a way that you don't get any other way. And I truly appreciate that about God.
Well, folks, the book is entitled Dear God, We Need to Talk. It's from Passio Publishing out of Charisma House. It's by Darren Schalk. And Reverend, we appreciate your time. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you. I truly enjoyed it.
You bet. Take care now. You're listening to the Bob Dutko Show.